So I'm Steve Dickman from CBT Advisors. I'm CEO of CBT Advisors. We're a boutique consulting firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We work on mostly private companies for lots of top venture funds as well as early public companies. We've drafted a lot of business sections of the S1 and F1 documents for companies going public on NASDAQ. And a lot of our work lately, a growing amount, has been on healthcare IT. So it is a great pleasure and privilege to have the opportunity to host the Fireside Chat today with Vijay Pande. I guess I could have called you Professor Vijay Pande until recently. Vijay Pande, who's the newest partner, the bio partner at Andreessen Horowitz here in Palo Alto. And I was interested in getting a chance to chat with Vijay because of some interesting and provocative statements that I found on the Andreessen Horowitz website. It's a16z.com. And speaking of web links and references, the hashtag for the broader conference, it's BTS16 for Biotech Showcase. For this day-long Digital Health Showcase conference, it's DHS16. Please tweet. And I'm coming back to Andreessen Horowitz. What I read on their website was that software is going to eat drug discovery. And I think, even aside from long-range visions of AIs taking over the world, those of us who come from the drug discovery industry are intensely curious, let's put it that way, not to say mildly skeptical, or indeed deeply skeptical about what software can really do. So some of the questions that I'm going to be asking today really go at this interface of software and bio. Vijay Pande is well known in the academic world for having come up with clever, innovative solutions for creating software approaches to very, very tough problems in neuroscience and protein folding. And I'll let him tell you a little bit more about his background, but and what drove him to get out of academia, professor at Stanford, my goodness, to become a venture capitalist. And then I'll get into some questions about his work. We will open it up for audience questions at the end. We only have about 45 minutes, so about 5-10 minutes before the end, I'll look for a hand or two. But in the meantime, welcome. Thank you for joining me. And please, why don't you tell us a little bit about sort of your trajectory and what's been driving you on this path?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So thanks for having me. When I think about my trajectory, I've had sort of startups involved throughout my life, and so going to venture capital is very natural. The first startup I was in was when I was 15. This was actually a computer game company. We wrote games. The name of the company was Naughty Dog, and actually, actually was later sold to Sony and had a nice exit and so on. But startups have been in my blood, for a long time.
Where did you grow up?
So I grew up on the East Coast in a suburb of Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm. And when did you make the pilgrimage to California?
So actually, after going to college and grad school on the East Coast, I moved to Berkeley in '96. So actually, it's coming on 20 years for me in the Bay Area. It's funny how fast time flies.
Once you put on the Birkenstocks.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and so once within a week, when I talked to my parents about my new place here, they could tell I was never moving back to the East Coast. But so it was interesting because in '99 I became a professor at Stanford, and within months, people from Sand Hill started engaging with me, and I think this is fairly common. First for diligence, and then for maybe beyond scientific advisory boards, and then board of directors of companies. And so while I've been at Stanford since 1999 until just recently, I've had this intertwining of startups all the way through, including founding startups. And so for me, moving to venture capital is very natural because over the last 15 years, with the things I did at Stanford, especially the Folding Home Distributed Computing project, where we really put together supercomputing class compute that really was impossible to get any other way. But interestingly, due to Moore's Law, what we got a Guinness World Record in 2007 for a petaflop is now $400 a day on Amazon. Okay. And so this is the interesting thing, and I think why there's an interesting opportunity now and why I'm excited about moving to venture capital now is what used to be extraordinary and rare and world record breaking. So we could talk about what Folding Home did. We could talk about the cost of a human genome. It used to be $3 billion in '97, and now the cost of goods is probably $300. And so the thing that's interesting is that there's a combination of these exponential decrease in costs, whether they're talking about the cost of compute, cost of storage, cost of mobile, cost of sensors with mobile, even the cost of genome sequencing. I think as human beings, we don't have really good intuitions for exponential increase or decrease. And what it means is in 10 years, things can change pretty dramatically. What used to be sort of a daydream and science fiction becomes something we take for granted. I mean, my favorite example is just, to pull out the iPhone. This isn't even 10 years old, iPhones. And if you put this back in time 10 years, people would think this is a prop from a sci-fi show. Not something real. And so what I think we're going to see in this biospace is that with this continued push of things like Moore's Law in this space, I think we're going to see similar types of advances. And 10 years is not that long for human beings, and I think it's an interesting time to be investing in this space.
Excellent. Yeah, of course, it's an interesting time for sure. I think what's interesting to me is that in the protein folding challenge, you effectively took an impossible problem and you made it tractable by breaking it down into pieces that could then be tractable, could be addressed, and even could be addressed locally, and even could be addressed on your or my PC or Mac. And I think that's an interesting theme, the idea that a problem that looks impossible that may not be impossible only if you can come up with a framework in which to actually address it piecemeal or break it down. And so what you're saying is that because the components are cheaper, whether it's storage or compute cycles or what have you, the breaking down piece becomes even more valuable.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that we see this in different ways. And so when we talk about software in healthcare, we're not necessarily talking about designing drugs, although that may be a part of it, and there may be connections there. We're talking about actually this much more broadly. So for instance, there's this whole area of digital therapeutics where behavioral therapies that have already been proven at being efficacious, but maybe it's just very expensive and difficult to scale, can be scaled computationally.
Yes.
And so there we're using the fact that mobile is something where people already own this thing. And actually, in some ways, we're all addicted to the messaging that we get on it and generally think of it as a bad thing. But that can be used for behavioral therapies, that the messaging of therapists and coaches can be quite effective in this type of thing.
Yeah,
So
I have to say, both at the broader conference, Biotech Showcase, and this year at Digital Health Showcase, some of the participating companies have actually leveraged the text messaging function as their sort of operating space, and it does seem like that's growing. So I guess one question that occurs to me, again, as a person with a more of a therapeutics background, is what are the limitations of your approach? That is, thinking about brain science, thinking about protein folding, biophysics. Those things would seem to lend themselves to compute-intensive approaches. But what about inflammatory diseases, medical devices, the healthcare world? Obviously, there are people using IT for healthcare, but what do you want to do, and where do you see it as being compatible?
Yeah, in terms of the areas that we're interested in, I think we're really not going to be investing in necessarily things that are traditional biotech. So if there's not a strong software component to it, that's not within our investment thesis. And so there's going to be many interesting companies in that space, but I think our point here is that there's going to be many companies in the space that we're talking about. And so we can subdivide this space in a couple different areas. One is this area of digital therapeutics, which I alluded to earlier. And what's intriguing to me there is that modern medicine has done a fantastic job in many ways. If you think about heart disease or antibiotics or things like this, is something where it used to be that 100 years ago you would just die if you had a bacterial infection. And the magic of modern medicine is that you take a pill and instead of dying, you're fine in a week or two. It's kind of amazing if you think about it. But that has its limits. If you think about areas like type 2 diabetes or depression or anxiety, those types of issues are something where I'm not sure that a pill is going to be really the right solution. And in fact, I think if we look back in the future, 10 years or 20 years from now, we're going to think it was kind of crude that a pill would be the immediate solution when a behavioral therapy would be the appropriate point. So that's one area. But these other areas I think are interesting too. The areas of machine learning, as we talked about, but in medicine. So how machine learning can help doctors, whether it be radiologists or doctors using genomics. And then the final area is an area of cloud biology, which I think speaks to ways that this could help in therapeutics, developing therapeutics as well.
Interesting. I mean, one area that occurs to me that already has a kind of, if not a computational theme, a combinatorial theme, it's the immune system. And the VDJ recombination, that's the heart of the diversity of all of our antibodies and T cells. Has it occurred to you to apply the computational paradigm there?
Yeah, I think, within the spaces I just laid out, I think people will use machine learning and other things in this space, but that's not necessarily really in the focus of what we're interested in.
Got it. So I want to pull back a little bit and think about role models, both in terms of investors as well as in terms of company founders. I mean, there have been many, many different ways to build value, both in venture capital broadly as well as in the narrower drug discovery or healthcare space. Who do you think of as your role models? What kind of investor do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah. So, if you think of the companies that have been very successful in the software space, you think of companies like Google or Facebook that are driven by brilliant, creative founders like Larry Page, Sergey Brin, or Mark Zuckerberg. And what's interesting about those founders is that they are really in a position where they can also pivot the company significantly.
Because they have so much control.
Well, also not just control, but they've experienced. They've seen the whole way through. So if someone was brought in as just a social network person, they could run Facebook, but they might not be able to help Facebook pivot. You think about the way Facebook pivoted into mobile. There was very much a recognition that this was not just an opportunity, but something that had to be done. And
deep doubt about whether they could do it.
Yeah, I think externally it would be interesting to see whether internally what their thoughts were. Yeah, but
Sure.
I think so. In terms of role models, I think these are the types of companies that we're interested in. Companies that can become big, that have large network effects, and they're driven by really exciting and fantastic founders.
Okay, so we'll certainly come back to the players in the ecosystem about who these founders are likely to be, where they're likely to emerge from. But you mentioned the idea of companies becoming big. Yellow Cab in San Francisco declared bankruptcy the other day.
Right.
And to me, that's a perfect example of a company being disrupted. I mean, you could put a lot of words on it, but I call it disrupted by, obviously, Uber and Lyft. So who would your companies be disrupting? What industry is going to be left a smoldering wreckage?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about healthcare is that there's many different parts of healthcare. And it's interesting that it's possible that certain old incumbents will be disrupted, or it's possible that they will actually be able to change with the times. So you think about a company like IBM, that you could think of them as a mainframe company, but they launched the PC revolution along with Apple and played a critical role. So I think it's really going to be interesting to see whether the incumbents embrace the new technology, or the issue with disruption is when the incumbents view it as a toy or with such great skepticism that they sort of don't engage.
Well, let me be more specific. Is it Merck and Pfizer in the top 20 pharmas? Is it Quintiles and Parexel in the top CROs? Is it the hospital system that you want your startups to disrupt? Who is it?
Yeah, I think we're looking at startups that are engaged in healthcare very broadly. But I think, and again, I don't think it has to be one versus the other in terms of the startups being successful doesn't mean that the incumbents can't be successful. And in fact, when you think about areas like digital therapeutics, it's very intriguing to think about, like, let's say, Omada Health, which is one of our portfolio companies that has a digital therapeutic for type 2 diabetes. They could partner with a pharma.
A digital therapeutic meaning FDA approved, it's gone through all the regulatory.
Well, so the interesting thing about digital therapeutics is that for them, they are really addressing particular issues that are clinically associated. For example, in type 2 diabetes, weight is a huge indicator for going from pre-diabetic to diabetic. And so in that sense, they don't have to engage in that sense, but they could choose to go forward and plant a flag down in terms of type 2 diabetes, or choose to engage with a small molecule as a synergistic combination, a new type of cocktail.
Yes. Okay. So, sure, I mean, disruption doesn't necessarily mean displacement, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think really it's an opportunity on both sides.
Yes. Well, I mean, certainly the investors, I mean, I just hosted a panel here where one of the investors came from Novartis. And so Novartis has set up a whole fund, DRX Capital, to invest in this interface. So certainly there are incumbents who are already playing in the ecosystem and are aware that they're going to have to morph from being traditional companies, healthcare companies, to being digital health companies, to the point where then digital health just is subsumed in the larger health world.
I could very much imagine that, and you could imagine they would be very active in M&A. And you think about like Cisco right now. Cisco does some R&D, but was pretty heavily involved in M&A. And I could imagine a very similar model on the pharma side, especially since pharma already has active M&A with biotechs.
Well, it certainly does answer one of the questions I haven't had a chance to ask yet, which is where's your exit? Clearly, targeting M&A exits is wise, especially given the somewhat disappointing performance of early health IT entrants on the public markets, Castlight being a good example, where it really didn't live up to the expectations, even though it had the best investors, it had an excellent management team, it looked like it had a good plan. The idea of getting acquired, it's quicker, simpler, cleaner, if you will, and maybe it's not quite as big an upside as building the next Facebook or Google, but maybe it's for a start good enough.
Yeah, I think there's many exits. I mean, possible exits. I mean, an IPO is still possible, especially if the valuation is kept more in line with what the public markets would value it. And maybe that's really the issue, isn't the IPO, is the disconnect between private and public markets.
Yep.
But then the other thing is acquisition is very natural. And the interesting thing for these companies is that the acquisition could be pretty broad. It could be a pharma, or it could be a company like Google.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I mean, I always, whenever I meet a venture capitalist, I always ask, where's your exit? So I want to get onto regulatory before we get to this interesting stuff about the software eating bio. No one that I know of, except maybe ACT UP, the HIV activism group, ever disrupted the FDA.
Yeah.
And our neighbor here in Northern California, 23andMe, tried to apparently ignore FDA and move fast and break things, and that didn't go so well. So one of the quotes that I read in a blog post on your website is, the process of getting bench to bedside is hardly a process at all, even at Stanford. And my observation would be, of course that's true, but one reason that the process is not a process is because there are regulatory burdens, barriers, hurdles, expectations, all of which really make it very, very difficult to do the kind of, let's say, raw innovation that you could do in the software space or in the mobile space. So this question about disrupting FDA, what's your strategy there?
Yeah, and I think the idea here is that the FDA is not going to be disrupted in the sense that it plays an important role. It's going to be there, but I think creative solutions to regulatory issues would be important. So, an example of this is, let's say, the area of drug repurposing, where you can de-risk phase one much earlier. Sometimes it means you can even avoid phase one, or maybe you go into phase one being much more confident. I think that's just one example, and I think the interesting companies in the space are thinking about regulatory strategies very explicitly. And so I don't view it as disrupting the FDA, but I view it as not necessarily sort of doing things just the way everyone else did before.
Yeah. I mean, look, there are different ways to approach this. One way that I've seen work is to develop products outside of the United States in gentler regulatory regimes and bring them in. Is that something you're thinking about?
I think that's one of many different strategies that we're seeing, and I think a lot of these strategies are part of the key business and go-to-market aspects of these companies. And so, successful companies will have, I think, great go-to-market plans.
Sure, absolutely. So then let's talk a little bit about the kinds of infrastructure that you would like to build for your companies. I think of it in terms of dollar amounts. Andreessen Horowitz is known in the Valley. There was a New Yorker profile of Mark Andreessen that sort of harped on this, that there's an HR function within A16Z that gets deployed into the startups so that they have, let's call it, gold quality HR from day one, which is something that startups have traditionally struggled with. So that model of deploying HR early and often, to me, feels like a capital-intensive model, whereas the other alternative approach would be the kind of lean startup, the couple of guys and a computer, or a couple of women and a computer and a sort of big idea, and then some cranking, some computing, etc. So what's your sort of fantasy portfolio? Is it composed entirely of one kind, the other kind, a mix, and what's driving your decision?
At Andreessen Horowitz, we love to work with very technical founders and people who can go very deep in the area, but it's our understanding that they will maybe not have the same business experience from that. And so actually I think Mark and Ben, when they created the firm, they really wanted to create a firm that would be able to give founders all of these things. And so the HR part, I think, is just one of many different aspects in terms of hiring talent, but also in helping in marketing and connecting to larger companies. We have an executive briefing center where pharma and providers and insurance companies and payers will come and we connect them to startups. So I think there's that whole component there, and the idea is that especially the general partners have this sort of entrepreneurial experience, such that we've been there in the trenches with them. This is actually connects to dollar amounts in the sense that with all of that, we can actually give relatively small amount of money to be able to de-risk the investments at different stages. And this is where maybe software VCs are different than biotech VCs. That at a seed round, which might be like maybe $2 or $3 million for a large seed, we can get companies that can actually very quickly get to some sort of product. And that by a Series A, where maybe we'd be investing 5 or 10, they'd be actually having revenue. And the revenue is useful because these companies are for-profit companies. There should be some revenue, obviously, but also it allows us to de-risk not just is this technology great, and not just is there a product, but is the product selling? And then at later stages, we'd put in more money to be able to accelerate the growth of sales. And so the key thing here is at every stage, we are using sort of data and evidence and to be able to assess whether the company's moving along.
Yeah, a biotech entrepreneur, a successful serial biotech entrepreneur, a friend of mine told me once that his key insight into how to build a venture-backed company in biotech, and presumably in all fields, is each new round of investment should be put in at significantly lower risk than the last round. Mm-hmm. That if you couldn't reduce the risk from one round to the next, you shouldn't try to get the next round. And it's actually a really powerful principle when you think about it. It's just the difference is, and I hear you when you say that a seed is $3 million. Some of the biotechs I know, there are funds in Boston, Atlas Venture being one, JJDC, Johnson Johnson Innovation being another, where I had a panel yesterday where the JJDC woman said that up to $1 million is the largest seed that they would do. But they're looking to answer a question like, does this kinase phosphorylate in that cell type? Mm-hmm. And the answer that comes out, of course, it's a kind of an intellectual construct. It's not a product,
right?
It's not something you can pilot on the internet.
Right. Well, I think the difference here is that actually, interestingly, software used to be much more like biotech maybe 10, 15 years ago. At that time, around 2000, if you want to build a big internet company, you'd have to spend $10 or $20 million on a server farm and build it up. I don't know if you've ever seen like the pictures of the early days of Google. They have them out with the servers that they built up and all this stuff. And that requires serious capital. But now with things like cloud computing, that's not necessary. That you could have something like Instagram that had just some small number of people could get to a product that really scales. So we're talking about 10 people, 20 people, 40 people, not hundreds or thousands of people, and not a ton of capital. Now, you might say biotech is very different and bio is different, but I think here's where what we call cloud biology is, I think, especially interesting. It's this direct analogy to cloud computing. You don't have to build a server farm. You can use cloud computing resources. Now, often it's common that you have to build out a lab. And so instead of building out a lab, cloud computing actually is very much analogous to, cloud biology is very analogous to cloud computing. That you can do things where you can actually write code to execute experiments. And you might say, well, we have CROs, how's this different than a CRO? Well, you could say the same thing about cloud computing, is that we had cloud computing, and you could say we could have done calculations on Sperry or IBM or Burroughs in the past, but it's the many aspects of the low-touch aspects of cloud computing that makes it interesting, and the elasticity. And we're seeing that on the cloud biology side as well.
Well, let's get to this. This is, to me, the heart of the discussion, is the clouding of biology, the software eating of bio. I did a few sort of informational interviews with folks in the biotech industry to sort of confirm my own biases, if you will, and validate my hypotheses. And it occurred to me, and these bio folks agreed with me, that there are two parts to discovery in the biotech universe. There's having a hypothesis and testing it. Mm-hmm. And there was consensus among the entrepreneurs I spoke to that, in fact, testing the hypothesis is fairly straightforward to cloud. That is, yes. If you assume, this is now a big assumption, but if you assume that a cellular assay that can be performed robotically, and one of the companies that came up on our prep call, it's Transcriptic, right, a robotic biology CRO startup here in California, CRO, a contract research organization. So a gun for hire that will perform your biological assay, but their wrinkle is that they'll perform the assay on robots, and that it'll be a kind of a quicker, easier interface for the user.
And more on demand, more elastic, more like a laptop and a credit card is all you need.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so the big sort of concept here is that if you had the hypothesis, and the hypothesis involved cellular assays, and the assay was on the menu there at Transcriptic, similar to a traditional CRO, you could essentially, get your credit card, push a button, and get an answer back to your assay. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, that's very interesting thing. I want to clarify one thing, because sometimes it's the terminology is confusing. Is that when we're talking about cloud biology, we're talking about real-life experiments done in a remote facility, typically by robots or heavily roboticized. And we're seeing things both in terms of in vitro experiments and even now more recently in animal experiments too. So one can go sort of in principle the full preclinical route on the cloud side. And I think it's an important point that it's not going to be that the computer's sort of doing everything for you. Maybe in time that was something that we can dream about, but right now removing the friction to be able to do things is very intriguing, especially since now a lot of the companies that we're seeing in this space look more like software companies because the lab is done remotely. If you go to their offices, there's a bunch of desks and laptops and stuff.
Well, I would push back a bit and say, my source's startup, it was in an innovation center, an incubator, and then it moved to a former bank, and they never had a lab.
Yeah.
I mean, they outsourced everything from day one, and you didn't have to cloud anything. Their outsourcing was to flesh and blood CROs.
Yeah, I think that the CRO, in my experience, just has been much more heavy touch. And it's, again, not like unlike in cloud computing where you could outsource to IBM, but you'd have to do this large, big contract rather than having something that's much more light touch.
Okay.
And the friction part is not to be underestimated. I think you think about services like Airbnb or Lyft and Uber, you could have done that with a mobile. We could just go to our laptop and do things. But mobile really reduces the friction to make it possible. And human beings are surprisingly lazy. That a little bit of friction goes a long way to making something either happen or not happen.
Well, let's leave it out there. I don't think we're done yet on the question of execution because I think that the friction that you're talking about, the cycle times, I think that there can actually be significant friction in outsourcing. Now, I admit that I am shifting the time frame a little bit because initially I was talking about doing an initial validation experiment in a cellular assay. But if we move downstream a little bit, I mean, my source has just recently de-virtualized his biotech company. Mm-hmm. And that means that after 2 years of nothing but outsourcing, they are spending $10 million in building a lab presence.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. And the reason is biology.
Yeah. I could totally see that happening, but I think the intriguing thing is on the startup side.
Yeah.
You can do so much without it, and I think that's the main point here.
Well,
and for instance, Google and Facebook run their own server farms.
Okay.
So
they own infrastructure too.
Yeah. But for a startup company at the early stages, this presents opportunities that just didn't exist before.
No, sure. I mean, the model in my mind is always, you mentioned Instagram. I'm thinking Waze.
Yeah.
A dozen people in Israel who built something that was the subject of a bidding war between Facebook and Google.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess I wanted to quote one of my sources, another serial entrepreneur in biotech, now working on his third company. The point is really not about making experiments more feasible. Software can do that. Increasing throughput, absolutely. And making the quality of data obtained higher, looking for greater uniformity.
Yeah.
He gives all those points up. But what he said is what never goes away in a setting where you want to drive innovation is that you have to figure out the biology, meaning hypotheses. And that's really the sort of first part of the equation. It's one thing to say execution, we're going to test a hypothesis. Who comes up with a hypothesis? Is that a computer? Is that a Stanford 24-year-old grad in sneakers or Birkenstocks? Or is that, does that have to be a experienced drug discovery research?
Right now I think, actually drug discovery has the biology component and the chemistry component.
For sure.
And so the biology component often is done in academia anyways, as it is, and in many ways. And so it's not clear to me that these startups are going to be doing that much biology. I mean, they'll be doing much more stuff on the chemistry side, especially.
That's an important distinction.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, of course, the NIH funds the large majority of, I would claim, the biology innovation, especially drug discovery-focused biology innovation in the world today. I think the NIH is a disproportionate funder of that. And one reason is it's there. It's a $35 billion annual budget. But the other reason is that it's essentially so messy that you would never take dilutive equity in order to try to find it.
And it's also, I think, well suited to academia and academic temperament, whereas drug design is a very different type of activity.
Yes, and chemistry, I'm totally there. I mean, there's Schrodinger, there are other companies that are well established already in applying computational methods to rationalize the process.
Schrodinger is, which I'm actually on the scientific board, just for disclosure, but I think Schrodinger is especially doing something that is, I would not say is cloud biology. They're doing computation, which is also interesting.
And chemistry-focused
computation.
Right.
Yeah. But I think to get at your point, and I think connected back to something that I think is going to be, interesting in the future, is the idea that when we talk about developing hypotheses, we're bringing in concepts of machine learning. And machine learning and how to handle data and things like that, I think that is a very interesting question in general. And it's not that it goes from nothing to everything overnight. But what happens with machine learning is that first everyone thinks it's ridiculous that you'll never be able to even park the car by itself. And then lo and behold, cars are parking themselves. And those are standard features, as we were talking about earlier. And then, well, yeah, okay, but the car would never be able to drive itself. But actually, Teslas right now can drive itself. I maybe just wouldn't sit in the back seat during that. But you can sit there, and for the most part, it can drive you home. And as time goes on, we take things that used to be impossible just for granted, and it just marches along. It's not that it goes from nothing to everything overnight. And so what I expect we'll see is that, sure, it's not going to be the computers driving everything, but first it's facilitating, like the parking part. It's doing the parts that are hard or certain problems. And as time goes on, we'll see more and more of it sneak in.
So I'm glad that you brought this up. I mean, we'll come back to the point about the brains in a second, but just on the execution, the deployment of 10 or 20 smart people who are hardworking, who are going to create value for a venture capitalist. So you're making a personal transition from the relatively hands-on world of academia, of designing experiments, getting NIH grants, getting Stanford to support you, building infrastructure,
and
running them.
And running startups on the side.
Well,
yeah.
but I'm saying now you're moving heavy duty into the startup world. And specifically, you're not moving in as an entrepreneur. You are an entrepreneur, of course, but you're moving in as the sort of the puppeteer, as it were.
I'm not sure how to put it that way. But I
you're
think
one
really
level removed.
Well, actually, it's interesting because as a faculty member at Stanford, I ran my lab very much like a startup. So folding at home, I always joked, in around 2000, that it was the hours and the workload and the intensity and the need to execute were just like a startup. We're just like a startup, just without the stock options. And I think that part is very familiar to me. But the way I ran my lab is that I would be very sort of, I would pick really brilliant people and not micromanage them. Okay. And be there to give them support and funding and vision and help and get into the trenches as necessary. And that's not unlike the role of a general partner, especially a firm like Andreessen Horowitz.
Okay.
Where I'll be on the boards of these companies, meeting with them frequently, talking about where they're going, planning strategically, as well as jumping into the trenches when necessary.
Well, let me focus the question even more sharply. We talked before about the breaking down of big, hairy, complex problems, and then you have had quite some success in doing that. So how do you think about your role at Andreessen Horowitz? Is it more that you're going to be the one breaking down the problems, or is it more like you're going to wait for opportunistic startups to show up who have already broken down the problem and are going to take on a tractable chunk of it, and you're going to go, pattern recognition, it's that?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. I think there are certain areas that I'm excited to fund and looking to see for people how they figure it out. Similarly, at Stanford, if I was the only one providing the creative ideas, my group would not be what it was. And so it has to be where other people are coming up with really brilliant ideas, and then I'm helping them with them. And I think this is very much analogous.
Okay, so I promise to come back to the clouding because I'm not done there. But on locations, it's something else that we talked about.
Yeah.
A question about where geographically you think it's a good idea to be investing. And I ask this with a real edge in the sense that the internet has opened entrepreneurial space to a much bigger geographic realm than was ever possible before. And ironically, venture capitalists still invest heavily locally. Ironically, the bulk of the portfolio of your fund, and frankly, almost all funds in this time zone, are local. And so it seems a bit paradoxical to me. So where do you see, given that the borders are relatively open, given that the internet makes it possible for entrepreneurs in 190 countries to get access to the same raw material, and especially if it's cloudable, manipulate it, where do you think the startups are going to come from, and why do you think it would be a good idea to keep investing locally?
Yeah, so it's interesting to ask the question, maybe what makes big companies big? And a common way is that they have some sort of network effect. And
network effect.
Yeah, and so it's a barrier to entry. So you think about Facebook, or you think about, let's say, eBay. A fantastic programmer, in principle, could write a sort of baby version of eBay, maybe even in a weekend, right? But that would never be a successful company now because they have a network effect of combining buyers and sellers. And so it's and that's a huge part of it. You think about what makes Silicon Valley so interesting is that, in a sense, it is the result of a huge network effect, and that people come, whether we're talking about academics with great universities, Stanford, UCSF, Berkeley, and so on, venture capital, great founders, big companies, small companies, and so on. There's a network effect here that in the software space that's really unbeatable. And I think those types of network effects just grow over time. And you could try to copy them the way someone's copied eBay. But I think if we look at the results, they've done well, but it's not something that's very easy to reproduce. And once that network starts rolling, there's a real power there.
In other words, a large percentage of your investments are going to be in an hour's drive of your office.
Yeah, I suspect, maybe 3/4, something like that. I think that's what the firm averages.
3/4 of an hour, or 3/4 of
3/4 of the that would be nice, but 3/4 of the investments. But actually, an interesting thing too is the Bay Area now is itself broadened. There's all this interesting stuff, not just in the Valley, but here in San Francisco,
Mission Bay,
and Mission Bay, and in Oakland,
Emeryville,
and I bet it will move south of San Francisco and east of Berkeley.
Yes.
I think this whole thing is growing, and
Yes.
and so it's really Bay Area in general.
Okay. My cluster also has good network effects.
Yeah.
That is, I'm not saying my cluster is better than your cluster, but
Sure.
I work in Kendall Square.
Yeah.
And there's been an amazing explosion of
Yeah.
investment and
Yeah.
of new activity, highly funded, I would say highly
Yeah.
productive
Yeah.
activity that is itself potentiated by the intense density of academic researchers, top venture capital firms,
Exactly.
startups, and big pharma now.
Exactly.
Like 15 big pharma firms within
yeah.
2 blocks of my
I
office.
was
I'm not exaggerating.
I was a grad student at MIT, and every time, and I collaborate a lot with big pharma.
Yeah.
And so, every time I go back to MIT, it is really just breathtaking how the Cambridge campus there has become just one campus that has both pharma and biotech and academia. So I think that's basically making my point that network effects are important. But here's the interesting thing is that Boston used to be known for computer hardware. It used to be digital equipment was
Wang,
there,
yeah.
and Wang and all this stuff. And the Bay Area is known for software. And the interesting thing is, in the end, the cost of hardware goes to zero. That's Moore's law. The software becomes what's left. And when I reiterated all these interesting things about Moore's law and its siblings, the reason why software is so key is that when the cost of everything else goes to zero, that's the only thing that's left to put the components together. And so it'll be interesting to see, to the extent that software will play key roles in these spaces. I think the Silicon Valley network will be relevant to the extent that hardware, like new therapeutics and small molecules and all that stuff, I could see the Cambridge network being relevant. And I don't think this is something where I want to make it very clear, we're not saying that software is going to replace all of this, as much as that we think it can have a big impact and a very complementary impact.
But I guess my question would be the same way that it seems to me every pharmaceutical company in the universe has decided that it has to have a presence within Route 128 in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Don't you think you're missing something by focusing exclusively on business plans from companies that are within an hour's drive?
But that's outside of our investment thesis. We are really investing in software companies in the biospace, not traditional biotech. So software companies are here. Biotech is there.
Okay. I'll declare a truce on that one. So I'm looking around because it's a few minutes before we're going to have to conclude. And so if folks have a question, I'll be more than happy to take a couple of questions. And I do see a couple of questions coming up. So yes, go ahead. Please, and there's a microphone coming, and other side. And please just tell us your name, and please with your question. Go ahead.
I'll just speak loudly.
Just put the button to on.
No? Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
So one thing that makes the differentiation between sort of software and medicine and why you can't really apply the same models is the patient. So for instance, there will never be like a digital health Facebook or Google, because when I go to Facebook and I share my cat videos to my 3,000 friends, I accept that I'm going to get kitty litter ads for the next 3 months, okay? And that's not so bad. But there is no way that I am, if I'm going to go to my doctor and give a blood sample for some personalized medicine assay, that I'm going to share my genome with some database so it can be mined, and if that ever happens, and for instance, that database is hacked somehow, the liability for these companies shuts them down, whereas it's not like a $10 gift card from Target. And that is the very key point that none of these companies are addressing.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Cornelius. I'll take it for a second. The theme you're addressing is privacy, which is a very important one. My response to that would be that there's a company, patientslikeme.com, whose business model is that individuals share everything up to and including their genome about their disease, about their symptoms, about their responses to various drugs. There are millions of subscribers on their platform. Now, the explicit trade-off is, what they say about Facebook, if it's free to you, you're the product. So they're the product. The data that the patients are sharing is being packaged and sold to pharmaceutical companies. And that's in the disclaimer. There's a waiver that you sign when you get onto the site that says, I'm going to be able to get access to this amazing patient community for free, and I'll be willing to share whatever I want to share, but I'm explicitly accepting that it's going to be sold to pharmaceutical companies, let alone, it could be hacked, it could be shared, people could be used. It's like, yeah, I want it to be shared. There are going to be some people choosing it, but generally, of course, you're right, that not every business model is going to work in that space, and there are certainly going to be some limitations.
Yeah,
Please.
so I would add that I think that social area is a little bit of a red herring. When I talk about companies being like Facebook, I don't mean being social. I mean being big and data-driven and so on. I think a more practical version of this is that you go to get a clinical test. You get blood drawn, and what's happening under the scenes is that your genome's being sequenced, various biomarkers are being looked at, and maybe it's run through some machine learning such that it could compare for people that had similar biomarkers to you or similar genomic sequences or similar SNPs or whatever, that these drugs, let's say you have cancer and they're sequencing the tumor, that this kinase inhibitor is the right one instead of that one. And in this area, this could be a huge thing just to be able to prescribe the right drug at the right time. Now, in terms of the data could be easily anonymized, and so it can't be linked back to you.
The thing that you're missing here is that this is a one-by-one decision. Okay, unlike Facebook that's having something done, billions of people at the same time. This is a very you have to go to a doctor to do this. They have to sign a consent form. That's a one-by-one decision, not something that can be done over a platform.
But I think from the medical point of view, it will look like a clinical test.
There are lots of limitations for sure. I had another question up here. Please wait for the microphone and tell us who you are.
Some aspect might be a bit similar. So my name is Sharon. I'm the CEO of Star Tree Ventures, a boutique investment and business development consulting firm assisting investor finding investment opportunities in a different cluster in Israel. I see a lot of new software healthcare companies. I think the number is definitely increasing. And the big challenge that I see them struggling is finding the right business model, how to make it to generate revenues.
Lots of willing entrepreneurs and not a lot of good business models to go around.
Yes, especially because it's new, because it's the beginning, most of the data exists at the pharma companies, and it's to find the right way to do it with them, maybe. A lot of creative business model that you don't know what will succeed at the end. So I was wondering which business model have you seen recently that you think will be able to make it?
Yeah, I think there's many different ones. So I mean, it's almost too many to enumerate. But I think the things that I think will become big will be the things that create barriers to entry, obviously. And so what's interesting in this space is one way to create a barrier to entry is through data network effects. Let's say machine learning is very data hungry. And the companies that, let's say, get more data through, let's say, more patients or whatever will be more accurate, such that maybe another company will come in, but they won't be able to have the database to be able to do as well, such that even if they undercut on cost or margin, the original successful bigger company will still be able to be more accurate. And in healthcare, discount clinical tests isn't very exciting necessarily if it's if it's much less accurate. And so I think those types of approaches, something where there's the hope to be a large company, are the types of things that we look for, and to avoid the situation where there's not much of a barrier to entry, and therefore people come in and undercut a margin, and therefore nobody really wins big in that situation.
Yeah, I would actually go back to Israel and Waze. That the key strategic decision made by the founders of Waze was to not buy the data from TomTom or Garmin, but to build their own map. And I know that it was labor intensive and expensive, but in the end, that's what led to $1 billion exit. And I would encourage the little software companies, again, I consult for a living, so I'm always encouraging people to do all sorts of things. I would encourage the little software companies not to harness themselves to data sets that are exclusively accessible inside pharmaceutical companies. At the same time, if the data sets involve personal health, there's absolutely a privacy hurdle, and there are absolutely ethical hurdles there, and there are no clear answers. And very quickly, because again, coming back to the 23andMe example, you run into regulatory barriers as
The
well.
interesting thing is 23andMe came out of that just fine in the sense that that was an issue, it was addressed, and they've subsequently done some interesting deals in terms of the research data.
Oh, no question. I mean, they
Yeah.
signed a big Genentech deal, but I guess that the putative exit, if there is one, is going to come quite a few years later than the initial investors had expected. Those who invested, I know some of the VCs who invested around 2010,
Yeah.
and they would have thought they might be able to exit by now, and in fact, it's only getting interesting right now.
Right.
And regulatory was a big blindness towards regulatory requirements, I would say, or ignorance, or maybe even a move fast and break things mentality was actually the issue there that delayed the exit.
Possibly. I mean, I don't know. I think it's hard to sort of play it to think about what it would be like differently. But I think the key point is where they are now. I think is they're doing extremely well.
Yes. No, for sure. I think they are doing well. There are a few other companies out there. You mentioned Omada Health, and there are yet others that are aggregating data, that are putting together interesting packages of data. There are a bunch of companies presenting here at the Digital Health Showcase. I'm getting a signal from the back that it's time to wrap. There's another panel, so I wanted to thank the audience very much, and I wanted to thank you, Vijay, for a
Thank you.
stimulating discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.